I'm drawing this terrace house in an inner city suburb of Sydney using a 0.3mm Copic multiliner, freehand directly in pen. So every mark I put on the paper is going to be there at the end, and that's going to affect my strategy for drawing this. I start with these two windows because I think they're the two things that's going to be easiest for me to draw accurately, to get the proportions correct. And then I'll base the rest of the house, I'll build the rest of the house around these. I could have started by trying to define one of the box-like shapes of the upper or lower story, but I find that it's actually very hard to do that accurately when there's too much detail, because that affects our perception of the proportions. And if we don't get them right when we can't erase any lines first go, when we come to fill the detail in, there isn't room for it to fit in the right proportions. We end up with windows being too small or too large or too narrow to fit, because our overall, if you like, box shape that contains them ends up not being quite in the right proportions. I am wanting to draw this the same size as in the photo. I finish up drawing it slightly larger, but it's easy enough to have a sheet of paper that's a little bit larger than you think you might need. Now you can see me checking the angles. What I usually do is I do a dot or two dots or a faint line that I think is approximately right, and then I check it with my pen. If I'm drawing on location, I can check it the same way with the pen by holding the pen up directly in front of me at the angle of whatever I'm looking at and then bringing it straight down onto the paper. It works surprisingly well. And if my dots don't line up, I can adjust them. Using the windows as my reference, trying to work out exactly where these lines are. And as often is the case, I realise I don't have my paper quite straight in front of me, which ends up giving me lines that aren't as vertical as I thought they were when I drew them. This took me 40 minutes to draw in real time, and you're seeing it at 2¼ times normal speed. So if you want to watch me draw this at almost actual speed, almost real time speed, then use that cog icon and reduce the speed of the video down to half speed, and that will be virtually my actual speed. But of course it will take you longer. Now, I deliberately put lots of lines on my reference photo to show you what I'm looking at, but also how I'm thinking. So when I draw this awning, I'm really looking at that vertical difference between the upper and lower line of it. It's, I find, deceptive or misleading in some way to try and follow the curve or a diagonal. I find it's far more accurate to see, okay, what is the vertical gap between these lines, disregarding the angles for a moment, and then drawing my lines on that basis. I do the same with the roof on the top when I do that as well. Now at this point I'm becoming aware that I've drawn a bit larger than the reference. Now see how I align with what I've already drawn? One of the advantages of having the detail in the right proportion is that that detail becomes a means of checking alignment of things I'm about to draw with things I've already drawn. And you can see me doing the same thing with the chimney. And I do the same thing with the windows and the door on the lower level, on the ground floor level. So I'm keeping this a fairly simple drawing in terms of my line work. It's a fairly brisk line work approach. I'm not agonizing for absolute precision. I want accuracy, but I want it to have a fairly quickly drawn feel to it. This is just a single terrace. Normally we see them in groups. I suspect there was one to the left which has been pulled down at some stage when these buildings were not as desirable as they are now in Sydney. So I'm establishing some of the detail on the right-hand side because this is going to help me judge more accurately the lower part that I'm yet to draw, which is a little more complex. So there's a bit of detail. Drawing directly in pen, keeping things in the correct order is important. We don't want to draw lines that then go over the top of lines that we haven't yet drawn. So you'll notice I was, with the long horizontals on the front, I was establishing them within what I think of as the safety zone, where they're not too close to whatever they join on each end, because I often haven't quite worked out where that spot is. But I need to establish where they are to proceed the drawing. So here I have this gate on the side. I'd decided not to draw that back half of some sort of vehicle. I thought it really wasn't going to add to anything in this scene. Sometimes adding the vehicles in the street I think is a really effective thing to do, but not in this case. So this also lets me get a little bit of ground floor, ground level detail in, which I'm hoping will also serve as a bit of a warm-up for doing the main subject detail. So you can see me now aligning the door width and also where this lower floor window is in relation to the upstairs windows. I don't draw it in too much detail though, because I need to establish these plants, which are a fairly important part. These are the sorts of details it can be difficult to draw effectively, or to have them look as though they belong with the architecture. It's really important to work at drawing these sorts of details. They are very common and they do add a strong sense of domestic use, but they can be a bit of a challenge. We can overdraw them, we can underdraw them. We want them all to look pretty different from each other, and we want them to look as though they're sitting behind this steel fence, this iron railed fence, but in front of the building. So we want to also draw them in a way that they have the correct depth of plane for where they sit within our subject area. Again, more alignment using the windows. And with the foliage, I really just want to get a sense of the type of foliage, so these long, thin, spiky bursts of leaf, probably some sort of yucca plant, some semi-desert plant, and a more usual foliage tree in a tub on the right-hand side. So you can see with this iron railed fence, that part of it I'm creating the sense of by negative space. So where I've got really dark values behind it with the pots, I'm drawing those in a way where the iron railing becomes a gap between my value. But where it's a light value behind the railing, where the building is, I draw it as a positive thing. I draw the actual rails. And I go on to do a third thing, and that's at the very base of the rails, we have a darker area, which is the floor going back from the front of the terrace to the wall. And I do the rail a little bit darker there so that it stands out more clearly. And I find that visually it all comes together nicely with a sense of realism. Now, I'm doing this palm tree next door. I thought it was a great contrast with the other foliage that we're going to have behind the building. And palm trees are a great subject to try and draw. The biggest challenge is to not default to a cartoon-like palm tree that has long fronds all coming out on the one plane on each side, all looking the same. We want to capture the sense of these fronds are coming out in 360 degrees almost, and therefore how each frond look is fundamentally different depending on that angle that we see it from. I do a little more work on the frond when the house is finished at the end, when I add the rest of the details on that left-hand side. I wasn't going to actually draw the house at this point on the left-hand side, but after I'd done pretty much everything else, I thought it looked a bit empty. So I put what we can see there in, and I think it was very much the right solution. Now, I really messed up those bullnose corrugated iron suggestion lines, but in the end, I didn't notice them. They looked glaringly unhelpful when I did them, but often the things that we're not happy with end up playing a relatively minor role visually, and so it's not so bad. The challenge I'm going to have in a minute is to do the hatching for the shadow under the veranda. This is really important to do in these sorts of terraces, because this is really what's going to pop the sense of 3 dimensions, that this veranda is coming out and therefore it's creating shadow behind it. So I've done one level of hatching. I come across, and I often just hatch, but I do some cross hatching with this, but not at a hugely different angle. And I'm trying to work out how to do the door. I don't want to do it completely as a black hole. I want to have some suggestion of some sort of form in the timber behind it without it becoming too dominant. So finding that balance between the two is important. One thing I did that I forgot to mention as I was doing it in the video was I underestimated the height of the ground floor. As I came down, I established the lower line of the fence just a little bit too high on the page. And it wasn't so obvious until I began to add some of the features in. And I found that I was able to draw a couple of more horizontal lines and drop the whole thing by about 5 mil. And that, in my mind, re-established better proportions for the overall building. So I'm now really just working on the hatching and the details on the veranda, trying to get those right. I want to make sure I come in dark enough in this shadow, and it is a bit darker towards the top. I probably should have gone a bit darker even than I did. I got a bit distracted at that stage with some things that were happening here, but and probably the foliage on this tree on the right is a bit too white. I probably should have gone a bit darker behind it on the back wall, and then just come over at least in parts of the foliage of that right-hand tree, making it just a little bit darker in value. But now I've jumped up to the roof line and doing these trees at the back, and just look at the huge difference, the huge improvement visually this makes to my drawing. It really kind of pops out this terrace house to have these dark values in this corner. And what was a very plain, quite boring section of the drawing suddenly becomes an important part. And it's a lovely play off, a lovely balance with this very plain, very bare wall that we have there. And now just doing some corrugations of this, and then I've really just got the detail to do on the left-hand side where this house is. Drawing freehand in ink is a great drawing approach to try and develop. It can be very intimidating. I deliberately started doing it so that I wouldn't be so perfectionistic. I was sick of erasing so much, and I thought, well, if I draw with a pen, I can't erase, so I just have to learn to go with it. And I found psychologically it was a huge benefit for me in my drawing, and it helped me develop a much more enjoyable mental attitude to the whole process of drawing. And it certainly sped things up because I wasn't having to draw the same line 4 or 5 times just in case I could draw it slightly more perfect. And it helped me appreciate that in the end, it's the overall combination of all the marks we put on the paper more than the perfection, the accuracy of any one. I mean, clearly there are some things that do still impact the end, but in this case, I think everything came together quite nicely. And then we're done. Of course, you'll find this photo on my channel community page if you want to have a go drawing this Sydney terrace house yourself. And here it is. What do you think? Just have a look at it without the reference photo. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this interesting. I hope you have a go drawing the terrace, whichever strategy, whichever approach to drawing you do. But whatever you use, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.